What's up YouTube, and welcome back to another Procreate tutorial where today we're going to go ahead and create a pixie magical forest design with our teeny tiny character here. Now, as always, there's links to everything you're going to need for today's design over on my Patreon. Don't be put off, all of the requirements are completely free. You'll find the guide, you'll find the palette for today's design so you can follow along with the exact same colors and the canvas size. Everything else is built into Procreate. You won't need any additional brushes. Now, while you're over there, make sure to check out my Patreon because that's where I post 3 exclusive tutorials every single month. And my patrons now have access to over 120, nearly 130 exclusive tutorials at the time of recording. You can get access to every single one of them when you join, and you can see every single tutorial design over on my website before you join. There's links to my Patreon and my website in the description down below. And if you could do me a solid and subscribe to the channel, I post weekly Procreate tutorials here on my channel, so make sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. Enjoy today's tutorial, and let's get started. So once you've created your canvas and you've added in today's guide, you're good to go. Now, this very simple guide, of course. And if you've not gone ahead and done this yet, all you want to do is download the PNG image, then go to your actions, go to the option of add and insert it as a photo. It will insert it as a new layer, and that new layer I've simply just tapped on it and I've renamed it and I've called it guide. That way we don't delete it, or we just know that where it should sit. And I've got a brand new empty layer underneath. And first of all, let's go ahead and set our background color. So we're going to go to our background color. We're going to grab the color in the bottom right of the palette. It's fairly dark, and hit done. Now, of course, our guide now we can't even see. So if we tap on our guide, if you use the option of invert, it flips the color the opposite way. So if it's black, which it was, if we hit invert, it now flicks it to white. We can probably tap on that and bring the opacity down to say around about 50 for now. On the empty layer here, we're going to go ahead and go to our colors. We're going to start adding in some very simple background elements. So we're going to grab, for example, the top right color in the palette, this nice dark brownish tone. And as I've been doing a lot lately, we're going to go to our brush. We're going to go to inking and the dry ink brush. I love this brush at the minute, can't get enough of it. Now I'm going to set my opacity to 20%. And by the way, I've got 3 markers here. I've got 20%, 35 and 50. You tap on the plus icon, which usually sits here, and then you can add a marker, for example, like that. And if you add the 50, the 35 and the 20, you'll know exactly where I am every single time based off of where the marker is. And my brush size marker there is 30% because I usually like the fact that you can press quite firm, get a large brush, but I can also press really lightly and get some nice thin marks as well. So we're going to go 20% on the opacity, 30% on the size. We are just going to start adding in some very basic content in the background. Now, some of this will be super faint, and that's a good thing. I want to add in like the shape of a tree here and maybe just a few more brush strokes through it, but nothing too, we don't want to make it too vibrant. It's going to get blurred out in a second anyway. So we just want to sort of keep it nice and faint. Another tree there. Let's just add in some kind of nod towards some kind of tree-like shapes here. A couple of streaks through, nothing too heavy, nothing too intense in terms of actually, trying to detail. This tree here, I'm just adding the tiniest bit more to it and that's it. The rest of it can stay pretty light like that. We're going to go to our colors and then start adding in some green tones. So we're going to go to let's grab the middle, first of all, the middle of the far right column. And in one brush stroke, I want you to press really firm so you can get some nice big blobs. I just want you to wiggle in here some distant areas of color, and you can let go occasionally, just like a few little areas of green here and there, just towards the top area. And I'm actually going to go ahead and reduce the opacity down to 10%. So I can just add in some super light patches of green in the gaps potentially, like a little squiggle or wiggle here and there. And then I'm just going to go to my colors. I'm going to utilize these 2 greens as well, just adding in some variety. So top of the second column from the right, maybe like a little bit of additional green. I'm still at 10%, so I can build this up nicely, just layering in some additional tones and color in the background, but keeping it really light in terms of color. We don't want to add in too much. Again, the middle color of that second column from the right, and a little trickle of green in there. Couple of dashes in the distant areas, just to add in some tone throughout the whole of the forest. And I'm going to add in just a tiny bit more green in here. I'm going to go up to 20%. Just want to add in a little bit more tone in there, and maybe the occasional bit of sort of break down these shapes a little bit more by just using a very light percentage, but breaking down some of those kind of bold paint strokes. I know they're going to get blurred, but I don't want anything that's going to look too obvious, and I want to have some variety in there. So I'm just going to zigzag my way through here, maybe a couple more further down, and then maybe just break up this shape over there because that was a little bit too perfect. Now adding in the green, I know I need to go back to my colors, and I'm going to go ahead and grab the color top right of the palette again and just add in the tiniest sort of brighter streak in this tree here, and that's it. We will now blur this, so we'll go up to our adjustments, we'll go to Gaussian blur, and we'll swipe from left to right, adding in around about an 11% Gaussian blur. We want this really lovely shallow depth of focus, so something like this, and tap on your adjustments when you're done. We then want to go ahead and block in some other shapes, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. I'm going to go to my colors, I'm going to grab the color at the top of the third column there. We want maximum opacity when we're drawing in basic shapes, and we want to set the brush size to something small, around about 7%. We're going to follow this tree line here all the way down. You want to press nice and firm with your pen. You can add in occasional tiny little wobbles, but you're not going to see too much of this tree, to be honest. And as long as you go very top to bottom, you should be able to drag and drop the color into that right hand side. Let's then go ahead and also rename that and just call it right side, because that's going to be our foreground as well. We're going to create a new layer, drag it underneath the right side. This is going to be our fallen tree here, our bridge. So I'm going to go along here, and I'm just going to follow the guide. And at this point, it's just a matter of laying in those basic shapes. That's why we're using the guide, really. And then over here, I'm drawing as we speak across the top of the tree, all the way off to the edge. So I can drag and drop the color in. Very subtle change of color, but you can just about see it on camera. And then we'll go to our layer, we'll rename it and we'll call it tree. Well, we know it's the tree bridge. We'll create a new layer, drag it underneath the tree. So hold down on the layer. If it lets me, we'll hold down on the layer, drag it underneath the tree. And then we're going to add this one over here in the same fashion. So let's go ahead and just create that tree there. I'm going to try and add in the tiniest bit of character to it in terms of wobbles. And then I'm going to follow down into here and then just create kind of the root line. This tree's massive over here on the left, and we'll drag it into that left-hand side. Then what we're going to go ahead and do is rename that and call it left side. And we're then going to add in some other ground effects as well. Now I'm going to add it in front of the left side for a minute. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to go to my colors. And again, we're going to utilize a bunch of these colors over here. We'll start off with, let's say, the top of the second column from the right. We'll go back to our brush making again. It is making sure it is the dry ink at 30% size. I'm going to go to around about the 35% brush opacity. And in the ground down here, I just want you to really randomize some squiggles and wiggles. Now I'm probably going to bring the opacity down to 20. It's a bit too bold straight away for me, to be honest. I'm going to bring that down. I might even bring it down to 10 again, just so I can lay it in a little bit lighter towards the back. But lots of random wiggles and squiggles and dashes, to be honest, and like random diagonal lines off on the edges will look great. But we're in front of this tree here. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off my guide for a second so you can just see the basic shapes. And I'm just going to go ahead and just towards the base of the tree, just show all this greenery around the base. So just layering in all the color down here, leaving gaps. We want lots of gaps and we want lots of variety in color. That's why I want you to just tap like crazy and add in occasional taps and just little layering of color. So you can go over yourself a few times so you get a lovely little bright spot occasionally. Little something like this, and maybe just a little bit up the bottom of that tree there. Keeping it super, super simple. Then go to your colors. Let's add in some other color tones. Let's grab the middle of that far right column. Slightly different green, less saturated, but a little bit more on that, leaning towards a yellowy tone almost. I'm just gonna dash this in all over the place. Again, hoping to try and leave some gaps, but it's not a critical matter if I don't. The only thing I also wanna do is just really lightly, I'm still at 10% opacity, just trying to just cover up the base of this big massive tree into the ground down here. Leave the very edge of the sort of frame down here as well. We don't really want to sort of detail that too much. It's more just this little bit underneath our bridge. I'll go to my colors. I'm going to grab the brown at the top of the third column from the right now. And then I'll just try and sort of intertwine some brown into the kind of base of the ground down here. So just like a few lines, just making their way in towards the green ground below. A little something like this. And as you guessed, we're going to go ahead and blur this out. So we're going to go to our adjustments, Gaussian blur. We're going to swipe from left to right, and something around about the 8% will do the trick. It will get rid of quite a lot of that detail. You could go to like a 7 and preserve it a little bit more. So I'm going to do a 6 or 7% and then tap on my adjustments when I'm done. And then we're going to go ahead and create another new layer. We're going to go to our colors and grab the background color, the bottom right of the palette down here. And we're going to zoom in and just start to draw in with a very low opacity still on top of some of those sort of quite fine lines. I'm scribbling on top. I might even go to the 20% marker and just wiggle on top. So what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to add in what appears to be much more fine detail. So this is kind of what we're going for. Lots of taps and scrapes there just to break up the pen lines and to a degree reintroduce the shadows as well. So you'll end up breaking down a lot of those lovely little shapes that you created, but it will add far more grainy kind of detail, as if you've sat and meticulously drawn out a ground floor down here. And because it's out of focus, you don't want to sort of pay too much attention to it. You just want to add in all these little additional slightly darker tones that match the background color, and then you can break it down. By all means, go to 35%, be a bit braver with your color application and just see where you think you can break this down. Creating grooves and divots is a really bold move. So for example, just creating a really dark patch in the middle there is a really brave move, and I urge you to try and do it, where you just end up saying there is no color there. It's just a dark patch and the light isn't quite catching into that space, and that's how I envision the ground. And I love that. It's a brave move, as I said. So a little bit of extra detail there. I think I'm going to leave the detail as it is. I'm not sure I'm going to blur it at this stage. Potentially I could come back to it and blur it, but I'm going to leave it for the moment. Let's go ahead and add in some color to our main tree trunk there. So we're going to go ahead, the layers that we just created, I'm going to swipe from left to right on both of them, which is our ground layers down there, group them together and rename that and call it ground. With that collapsed down, we're going to go ahead and collapse the group. We will go to our tree here. We're going to create a new layer, tap on it and clipping mask it, swipe from left to right on both and group them together and rename this. And we'll call it bridge this time so we know it's the bridge group. And then the clip layer, we're going to go to our colors, going to grab the middle of the third column. I'm going to start off with the 35% opacity, again, still 30% on the old marker there. And we're going to go ahead and just add in some lines. Now, obviously look at the direction of the tree here. By all means, bring back in your guide if you need to, just to see the direction. And that's the direction of the tree. So you want to kind of draw in some sort of barky kind of lines here. You could even go slightly bigger, up to 63% there, just towards the middle of the body of the tree. They want to get a bit chunkier down here, a little bit thinner in the distance. So you can create some much needed thin lines back there, and then occasionally some nice big chunky lines. Now we want to leave gaps. We want gaps in here. So I'm just going to flush that out with a little bit of tree bark there running all the way to the end. And it's pointing us, it's visually showing us where we need to be looking. That's the direction of the tree. That's the flow of the design. Now we're also going to go ahead and create a new layer in front of that. Tap on it and also clipping mask it. Go to your colors and again grab the base tone of the tree, which is the top of the third column. We're going to go maximum opacity. Probably going to set the size down to around about, say, 10%. And we're going to go ahead and just start hacking through here. So probably even smaller than that. You could go down to like a 3%. And what we're doing is we're drawing in individual sort of grooves in the tree there. So you can create these beautiful detailed elements by just creating thick lines, thin lines. You can really fade out at the edge of a line as well. I want to, most importantly, get rid of the kind of the brush stroke ends of the pen a tiny bit, but also introduce this lovely little bit of grain that's just running through our tree and just creating horizontal lines. Occasionally you make some a little bit bigger in certain areas. Sometimes you maybe just make a line that's just, say, this long here, for example. But here is a prime example. We've got the end of the pen of the brush stroke, and just by running through here, you now split it into two, and then you create much more detail. So just creating lots of grain in the tree, following along those branch lines. Make some nice and big, and then also in some areas, just leave them quite sparing, especially up here towards the top. Leave this bit of brown here. Don't destroy it too much. That's where we want the light to cast onto later on. So you want some of those dark tones, but occasionally just, towards the middle of the tree, maybe even slightly lower, you can just break that down. And you kind of want to focus a lot of these lines over in this area here, not really letting them run too far down, but that again is something we could maybe adjust towards the latter stages should we feel is necessary. A couple more in there. I'm going to vary the brush size up to like an 8% now, just so I can purposely add in some quick and easy large brush strokes and emphasize literally the work that I've already done. But we should end up with some lovely grain in our tree. That's looking lovely. Let's go ahead and turn off our guide for a second because we're going to move on to adding in some greenery. I'm going to create a new layer. I don't want it clipped, so it's going to be top of the bridge group, but not clipped. 30% on the brush size. Let's go to 35% opacity. In colors, we want to start with some nice sort of muted tones. We're going to go top left of the palette, and we are going to start drawing in where we want our greenery to fall onto our tree here. So a couple of light bits of pressure towards the end here, and the majority of it is going to be focused in this area here with a kind of vine of sort falling down from there. So what you want to try and do is actually look on top of some of the kind of grain that you've created as well to draw in this kind of green mossy like greenery on top of our tree here, this bridge that's fallen, this beautiful mossy covering on top of here. And the lines can just follow suit with the tree. So you can have the lines kind of follow along that kind of horizontal path along the tree top there. And you want to try and do some in like fairly large brush strokes. Don't worry if you get right to the end and it's a bit too colorful, you can always tone it down. I'm going to run all the way along that top edge down to a thin point. The detail is going to fall off quite dramatically in those distant areas. So you can add some little sort of specks of green. And then as they start to get into here, I want to start planning out where I want that vine to come in. So I'm going to draw that in now by just following the curve. And when I feel like I've got to the halfway point of the tree, I'm going to go ahead and just run that down like so, all the way down to the forest floor below, and then connect it up and into the rest of it up here. Now don't add in tons and tons here. You want to have a few little gaps for darkness and shadow, of course. But up here on the top edge is where we predominantly want the majority of our lovely little green tones. So I'm going back over just a few of the greens that I've already laid in place, trying to see if I can just add in a little speckle of something else on top in terms of layering in that. What percentage are we at? 35% brush opacity. I'm going to run that all the way into this sort of point at the front here. Lovely. Now, of course, as you'd expect from a tutorial of mine, there's multiple colors, there's multiple stages to build up of all the different tone in here. So we're going to try and layer all that in. So keep it fairly simple just to start with. Simple will be better if I'm honest. And try to have like randomness. So like a little stray bit of green just running off on its own, like a little bit further away. So it's not all just one big bulk there in that space. So once we've done that, let's go ahead and go to our layers. Let's create a new layer. Let's then go ahead and reflect the forest floor in the tree. So we'll go to our colors. I'm going to grab the middle of the far right column and looking at the base of the tree in a similar fashion to how we added in the bark. I want you to just run along the tree. Now that's fairly high in opacity. I'm going to go 20% and maybe just lower the layer down in a second. But I'm going to run some of the underlighting here from the forest floor up and onto the base of our big fallen tree here, maybe a tiny bit onto some of those ridges of the brown that we created a second ago, but ultimately just like a little bit of green, just bouncing off, just the lighting kind of bouncing around a little bit, and then maybe color this in just the tiniest little bit more at the bottom. Now I want to keep that fairly faint, so I'm probably going to tap on the layer and I'm going to go to its opacity, bring that down, I reckon down to something around about say 74% for me. You're going to have to take a look at the video, of course, and see that kind of level of opacity at this stage and see if that works out the same way for you. Just maybe tone that down just a little bit. Now we're going to add some more color to this green area at the top. So I'm going to create another new layer. While we're here, the last layer we were just working on, which is the underside, just drag that underneath. It will clip itself, but just make sure that it is clipped at the top here to the tree. We want to go to this brand new empty layer at the top. We're going to go to our colors. Going to grab the middle of the first column. I'm going to go to, I mean, ideally I want to be somewhere around the 35 to 50% and the 30% size. because you want to start trying to be a little bit more bold with the application of it and build it all up. So I'm just going to tap around now on some of these edges just to start layering in some kind of more finer detail in here with the green tones. A couple of tibbity taps across the top edge there, a little bit on top of some of the greens, not all the greens. I'm not going to do too much to this little fella here or even further down, because all of those areas are probably going to get sort of lost in the sort of where is the sunlight conversation that we'll have later. So some of those areas that are a little bit further down, we can just say already, nope, I know that the sunlight's not going to catch there. Because of course, as you'll be able to see from the final design of today, that the majority of the sunlight is going to come bathing through onto our little subject, our little kind of pixie kind of shape here in this area here. So that's why this area of the forest is getting so much light and why the top of this tree's probably got so much moss on it and so on. A little bit of extra sunlight in its diet for the day. And then I'm going to run some random bits of green down there just to add in some variety to that vine, and maybe just occasionally a couple of little tibbity taps all over the place, especially along the top edge up here. I want to kind of fuzz up the edge. Now, the only thing I don't want to do is I'm going to just carry that in. I don't want to make this just like I've already done, a consistent line. So if you hold down on your eraser, it will switch it to the dry ink brush as the eraser, and I can get in there. You could have even done it at say 40% and just tone it down occasionally. So keep hold of some of it, but just make sure it's not all the same opacity. And then get back in there and just see if you can change it from what you drew previously, just so that there's a nice random element and scattering of all the green. So that's looking pretty good. One thing you'll notice is I've left this kind of groove here, this dark little space. That's something we're going to try and focus on, because if we bring back in our guide, our subject is already in that position. That's where I want them to be. I want them to then have a little bit of space to stand in that area. So bring back in your guide, just take a look at your layers now. Do you need to, potentially you just need to go ahead and grab both green layers and maybe move it down or up the tree, totally dependent on what you've already drawn, of course. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in further color. So I'm in my bridge group. I'm going to create a new layer. And on this layer, we're going to go to our colors. We're going to grab the light green at the bottom of the first column. And I'm going to try 50% and 30%. So 30% size, 50% opacity. In fact, the size probably needs to come down a little bit to about 18. And I'm going to tap away on some of these areas of the green here with little flicks and dashes and wobbles and dash-like shapes in here to just highlight some of them with even more finer detail. This is the process typically. You just want to start off nice and big and bulky with your shapes and then get back in there and start refining and adding in areas of light that's catching on our little mossy area here. And I want that, of course, to run right next to our subject along here, tapping away. Now I'm actually going to turn off the guide because I don't need that on at this stage. Although the subject is important, I don't want to see it necessarily at this stage. I want to be able to just draw in what we've already drawn and detail it. And especially when you zoom all the way out, we're starting to get that compression. I always call it crushing. It will crush the detail. By zooming all the way out, you compact it all down, and all those tiny little brush strokes become tiny little bits of data and information, and then they look fantastic because they look super detailed, crispy, lovely. And you can go all over the place. You can add like a random little speckle back there if you feel like there's just like a little bit of detail needed all the way back there. Now, don't do too many, but just a few in a slightly different sort of spot. Now we also need to go ahead and go to our colors and grab the top of the second column. And I'm going to keep it on the same layer for a minute. Same brush size of 18% and opacity 50. All of these dark green elements that we created in terms of the very first tones, these kind of tones here, we now want to start shadowing a little bit. So I'm going to get in there and start punching in some shadow tone on the left and sort of bottom edge of some of them. So I'm trying to create now some variety in the greens, adding in some darkness. You may even want to go up to say a 70% maybe on the opacity and really start punching in this area. We have got more shadows to add in, but it's a matter of adding in some shadows in those green tones to kind of break them down, make them look less, what's the word I'm looking for? They're less bold and really in your face. You're trying to tone them down, but also detail at the same time. You're creating grooves, you're creating little divots even if you've got a highlight tone there, I can punch a shadow right into behind there and let that live in that little space now, right behind the highlight, and that will look really effective. Here as well, we want to just break that down, a little bit of green on the underside. So some of these tones might be a little bit tricky. I hope they're not tricky to see on camera. You should be able to definitely see them in your own work. The rear here of the vine, towards the bottom, I'm probably going to just take away all of its color, to be honest, because it falls completely out of the sunlight. A little something like that. A couple of little random dashes in the gaps if you want to. We need to add loads more up here. And this is where you could also start to maybe, okay, I'll use this dark tone now to give my subject a little bit of space to stand in over here. So I'm just dashing all over the place. I'm going to go to 30% on the old brush size. Just seeing where I can darken up the little grooves in between all the little areas of green that I've created. You're creating so much more depth to it, so much more variety. And then down here especially, you can start to tone out a few of those greens as they just run off into the forest. You can add in, even more little dashes and scrapes if you wish, like I just did, and on top of some of those bark lines of your tree, just to say, yep, there is green there, but it falls out of the highlight. It really disappears. A little bit of green along here too, a little bit of green on there as it just disappears. So I'm going to kind of follow the tree edge there a tiny bit more, a little bit further down, just to maybe bring the shape into play a little bit more and maybe separate it from and behind there. Now, it's at this stage where I want to introduce our actual sunlight, because all of the further work that we're going to do about refining the highlight, adding more and more and more, if we add too much and then add the sunlight, it will just look awful. It will look too bright, too punchy, way too saturated. So we're going to go ahead and go to our layers and collapse the bridge down. We're going to create a new layer that sits in front of the bridge group and underneath the right side. We're going to go ahead and set the blend mode of this layer from normal to color dodge. We're going to go to our colors and grab the color at the bottom of the second column from the right. Your brush wants to be set to soft brush under airbrushing. I think size-wise, you could go to about 25%, and we're going to add in our beam of light. Now, you may want to do this multiple times, so just take your time and draw in that beam across. Look at that. It's beautiful. The way it just punches out the scenery in the background as well, and get all that color coming through. Now, I like that, but I'm going to turn it off, create a new version, color dodge, and just do it again. This is something I do quite frequently in my own work, where I'll maybe experiment with adding more or less and see how the lighting, where it lands on certain parts of the tree. I don't want to illuminate this area here that I've just made really, really bright for you. So there's a bit of a balance here of saying, where is the light coming down and onto our tree? And if anything, that is better than the first time I did it. I've done it at a bit more of a downward angle onto our little bit of a scene here. Now I also want to go ahead and create some beams. I'll delete the original one I created. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to drag it underneath though our color dodge layer. I'm going to set the blend mode from normal to add, of course, because it's a Joel Create tutorial. I always use it. And we're going to set the size to something really small, around about say 3% on the airbrush here. And then we want to go ahead and draw in some beams. So you can draw it in. Now that's really heavy. So I've got to be really, really light with drawing in some beams across. Now you may have to start really light and then hold your pen down so you can just direct that beam where you want it. Then think about maybe making a slightly smaller beam as well, like a 1 or 2% maybe, in towards like there. That one's really quite strong, but I'm going to roll with it and see how it goes. I'll add in another one. Now that angle doesn't quite match. So I'm going from like a point over here somewhere that I can see, and just like, there we go, that one's quite nice. And then I'm going to add in one kind of slightly larger 6% that may just overdo it, but we'll see what it comes out like. Just going to try that again. That doesn't look too bad. Now try your best then to actually add less. You don't want to add in too much here. Potentially I'll add in like a super faint one that just follows quite parallel to the one above. I actually really like that line, but I'm going to add one that's slightly parallel to it. And then I'm going to go to my adjustments, gauge and blur. I'm going to swipe from left to right, and we're going to blur those out nicely. So 10% does a really nice job of just diffusing those quite well. So we're going to go to about 9 to 10%, and then tap on your adjustments when you're done. So now you can already see the center of our scene really brightening up. Now, hopefully the colors transmit correctly through the camera to you. They're not super bright. This maybe I can see might look a little bit brighter, but I've probably fixed it in post, but it's just something to be aware of. Follow suit with the tutorial, it will all match up accordingly. Now that we've got some nice sort of highlights, we can now add further shadows into here as well. So we're going to open up the bridge again. At the top of our bridge group, we'll create a new layer. We'll go to our colors. We're going to go ahead and grab the middle now of the second column. Brush wants to go back to inking and the dry ink. We'll go 50% opacity, same size as always, 30%. And we're going to grab our greens now and really start to emphasize the shadows. This dark tone, we've got another dark tone in this this collection of greens, but what you're kind of looking for now is where you've got some green, towards the underside of them, you want to nicely add in some kind of shadow underneath it. So randomly allocating some shadow in there, but if you can scatter in some much needed dark tones in here now in your gaps, you can break all that down. I'm going to go even higher now. I'm going to go 70% on the brush opacity and really try and break down some of those green areas that I can see throughout the whole of the design up here. Now adding in a big dark area here will look really effective. It's just somewhere that's not getting any light. It's just as simple as that. Break this down, adding in some here. So what I'm looking for every single time, just to further explain it, let's find a good example. Let's find, for example, up here, this little cluster here. I've got these light greens, and then what I need to do is I'm looking for the bottom side of it, i.e. here, and maybe a couple that just stretch a little bit higher. So I'm darkening up the underside of it, giving it its like under shadow caused by the sun, but also just trying to break up the greens, how we layered them all in using the dark tone now can really help break them all down, give us some contrast. Contrast is key in giving us a really pleasing image to look at. So we're just breaking that all down now, trying to create that mossy kind of effect, emphasizing all the dark tones in all of these areas here, i.e. also down this lovely little vine we've got that can get quite dark, and maybe even a little bit darker on the far side of it. And all of these just need a tiny little bit of attention now just to break them up, add in those lovely dark tones. Some areas will just be nice and green, but some areas you can also factor in some shadow tone. So you don't have to break down every single element. If you like an area, just leave it. That's perfectly fine. Let's see what else. There's a tiny little sort of space up here, I think, where I could just maybe cram in a little bit of shadow tone up there just to give it a little bit more contrast, I think. And we're already now getting that kind of fluffy look to it. And by all means, as always, keep bringing in your guide. Keep looking for where your subject's going to be. Can you then add in like areas in the gaps that it doesn't sit in, or even shadow around it potentially as well. Now I'm going to turn off my guide for a second because I don't want the subject in there the whole time. And we're going to start moving into a little bit of a trick that I love to do at the minute, and that is just using color dodge. And so we're going to create a new layer. We're going to go ahead and change the blend mode from normal to the option of color dodge. We're going to go to our colors. We're going to grab the color in the bottom left of the palette, and let's go to 50% opacity, 30% on the size. We're going to keep building up those highlight tones. So let's keep going along where we've got some highlights already. Let's maybe even bring that up to 70%, and I'll bring the size down just a little bit so I can be a little bit more detailed. And then I'm going along, especially this top edge up here, hoping to try and sort of really bring out a few of those green tones with a little bit of extra brightness. So I'm following along those edges, tapping in there, adding all sorts of variety of taps to just emphasize some colors up here, adding in some color along some of these greens, especially where the sun is. We're going to zoom in down here, and we're going to keep emphasizing a few of these areas. I might go even smaller, down to like a 5%, and just see if I can start to flush in some quite bright areas in here with quite grainy kind of smaller elements of detail, especially up here on like the edge. We can add in these kind of little flicks right on the very end just to add in some little additional kind of elements, so they're kind of a little bit more fuzzy now rather than the brush strokes, you know. So let's keep going in here. Couple more along those edges there, just trying to fluff things up a tiny bit, especially in the curve here of our vine. Couple more flicks along there too. Let's see if we can just add in a few more back here. Now, I'm going to just add in, sorry, I can't stop myself, a few more back there. Let's go then also on the same layer and grab this color here, the bottom of the second column from the right. If we go to our opacity, set it to 30%, I think size, set it to maybe around about 20. You want to look for some of your brown streaks here, and you want to press really lightly, but you want to kind of accent the top edge of a few of them to show that light just crashing onto here, like so. You look at the color, it's going to get really orange and warm and beautiful, and you can pack in a singular area, if you can try and find it, that's getting a little bit enough of the light to really allow the colors to just pop out. I could maybe introduce like a little one there, and maybe just like a rogue one that's a bit further down that just must be sticking out just enough to catch some lighting. Don't do every single streak in there, but try to really emphasize a few areas that are just getting bathed in the sunlight. And this one here, I'm going to make my main one there, just really getting some lovely sun. I'll go into this gap here, just adding a tiny bit on some of the brown lines that I can see, and then that all falls off very, very quickly, like down there, where it all just starts to disappear. Lovely. Look at that, some nice bright tones. Again, they shouldn't be quite as bright on camera potentially as they look on my monitor that I can see. And then potentially just add in the tiniest little bit along the very bottom edge down here on some of those green marks as well, just to add in a little something at the very bottom there. And then utilizing this same light tone, we can get back into the greens, maybe a 50% opacity, and maybe go quite small, maybe around about 8%. You can use this color now as well to emphasize those green tones. So some of them now with this more vibrant, brighter tone here of our palette will be able to be exposed even more. So now we're just utilizing the color dodge, showing all the lovely color landing on top of here towards that top edge, a little bit in there as well. You're trying to emphasize all the areas you've already laid the blueprint out for. You've laid out all your highlights, and now you're just emphasizing them even more. Some additional little tones, and definitely towards that edge as well. You want to kind of give the moss this kind of lovely little highlighted edge to it, almost like it's got an outline almost on the top there. Lovely, nice and bright, lovely. Now we're going to go ahead and just create another new layer. I'm going to go to my colors and grab then the base tone, which is the top here of the top of the third column, with your brush set to probably around about the 15 to 20% mark and 50% opacity. For example, here I've got too much color in that area that just needs toning down, and I can manually do that. I can also emphasize these shadows a tiny bit more, but in some of the areas of the grooves, for example, underneath some of the moss there, I just need to tone that down the tiniest bit underneath. So I'm just adding in like a little bit of a drop shadow underneath some of the greenery there. I might even go down to say a 20% opacity and just try and tone that down even more like this by just really lightly, layer after layer of color, just toning it in, building up the shadow under there. There we go. That's looking nice and contrasty now. A little bit under there as well, and a little bit behind my vine, just to darken it up. It may look like a really, really subtle change, but we're just trying to add in those quite harsh shadows as well. Let's go ahead now and draw in our subject. So I'm going to go to my layers. I'm going to turn on my guide again. In front of the bridge group, I'm going to go ahead and create 2 new layers. We'll swipe from left to right on both of them and group them together, and we'll rename it and call it subject. The top layer out of the 2, we're going to go to our colors and grab the color up here, top of the 6th column on its own. You want to set the opacity to 100%. You want to set the brush size down to like a 1 or 2. We want to zoom in, and of course we've got this little silhouette here to draw in of our kind of woodland pixie kind of fantasy design here. So I'm going to draw in the kind of cape that I imagine, the pointed hood there at the back, and then up and into a bit of a curve at the front. Drag and drop the color in, and then draw in the legs at the bottom. Just keeping it fairly simple. I've wanted to introduce subjects into my art, and this is a really easy way of starting that process. So I'm going to turn off my guide at the top just to get an idea for my subject here. Maybe just emphasize the feet a little bit more. And it's just a fun little tiny element. Now, everybody's design is going to look slightly different with the subject based on where you put the beams. This is really important. The beams here will make a huge difference. If I have the beams, really on top, the sort of pixie there is going to look a little bit brown and orange. If I don't have them at all, it's going to look really dark. Neither way is incorrect. Both are completely fine. You could move your beams if you want to, but you're ultimately fine as you are. The only thing we're going to do is try to emphasize its position a little bit by adding in other elements. So the layer underneath our little pixie, you can go ahead and go to your colors and double tap at the bottom of the disk to select black. We'll just draw in a very sort of basic shadow off of the feet here. So like a bit of a long line stretching in behind. Now this is why I wanted something like a bit of moss here, perfectly positioned, because now the shadow can't stretch there too much. I could lower it down to 50% and set the size a little bit bigger and draw in like a little bit of a shadow on top of there, but I don't want to add in too much. I want the shadow to be a little bit contained in that area, but it's just enough to help the feet stand out. Now, mine is again slightly too dark because of where the beams are in the color. So I can tap on my shadow and bring the opacity down until it kind of matches my subject. So for me, that's around about 56%. And that's just where everybody's, as I said, will look slightly different. Now we can bring this to life a bit more by creating a new layer. At the top of the subject group, tap on it and clipping mask it to the subject. If we go to our colors and we grab this yellowy tone at the bottom of the second column from the right, we can go ahead and I'll set the opacity to 50% and we'll bring the size right down to about 3%. The first thing you can do is just accent sort of the edge here of our subject and maybe even like a little bit of color on the top there. Bring the opacity down there, bring it down to like a 20% and see if you can maybe sort of add in a bit of highlight maybe underneath the hood, maybe just a little something around the edge there just to emphasize like the edge of the face. It doesn't need to be anything sort of intense. The only thing otherwise is maybe like a little bit on the shoulder there as we wrap our little hood around, a little something like that, a little bit on the legs and the foot. There we go. And all the way down to the bottom. And I think that's just enough that we can outline our subject enough that it just makes them step out of the frame a bit more. Lovely. Now you'll know if you've listened to the sketch wave recently that that is something I want to try and introduce is a little bit more of like subjects in my work. And maybe they'll just be silhouettes. But for you, if that's something you also want to do, take your time with it. There's no rush to sort of draw something in super perfect and portraity and hyper realistic. It can just be something fun like this, just a little something to look at in your focal point. So there's my little tiny little pixie ready to go. We then want to focus on some of the other elements of like our trees on either side. So I'm going to collapse the subject down and I'm going to go to the left side for a moment, create a new layer in front and tap on it and clipping mask it. I'm going to go to my colors. I'm going to go ahead and grab the brown in the middle of the third column. I think the opacity probably wants to be fairly low for this. I'm going to keep it about 20% and a 30% size. So 20% opacity, 30% size. Ignore the very top of the tree. We don't want to add in anything up there. We want to kind of focus it where we can just about see some lighting appearing. And we're just drawing in some vertical kind of groove and bark lines of our tree here. You can go right up to the edge and a couple off the edge there. You can just about see them on screen where I'm now going to go back over a few of them to just add in a little bit more of the brown, but I've equally got a nice dark gap there in between to just really let the trees have some nice grooving to them. So a little something like that. Now we can bring this to life even more by going to our layers, creating another new layer. And then if we select the last layer that we just worked on, and we go to the option of select, it's really important that color fill here in the bottom left is grayed out. Otherwise you won't be able to do this. Then go to your layers, go to the layer above that you just created, tap on it and mask it. Then tap on your selection tool. Now make sure you tap on the layer here and then go to your blend mode and go to color dodge. Now before we carry on, what we've done is we've created a mask that matches the shape of those bark lines. All we've told this layer is, this is what I've drawn on this layer. I want to add a mask that matches that shape, meaning now what we draw on this layer can only show if it falls on top of the brown before. I do that sometimes. If you essentially want to clip a layer to a clip layer, you can't do that. So this is the way of getting around it. So with this set to color dodge, we've got our colors. We're going to grab then the color here, bottom of the second column from the right. Our brush needs to change though to airbrushing and the soft brush. Let's go to around about, let's go to about sort of 12%. And you want to keep this nice and light. Don't add in too much. Just bring a little bit of a glow across the tree like so. Just a little bit like that. Just very simple. You can fade it up a tiny bit more if you wish, but just a little bit of color on that tree in the distance. Now, if anything, you don't want it to compete with your tree, your main tree. So you can tap on it and just bring its opacity down a little bit. Bring it down to say 60 to 70%. You always want your focal point and your main area of subject matter to be the best and the brightest it can be. Now we also want to add in a similar effect to this tree here on the right. Now, if you're done with it, you can pinch those layers together on the left there, or swipe from left to right on all three, group them together and just rename it and call it left side tree. Collapse the group down. We will go to our right side tree at the very top. We'll create a new layer, tap on it and clipping mask it. We're going to do a very similar process, if not the same. We're going to go to our colors, going to grab the middle of the third column. Your brush wants to be set to the option of inking and the dry ink. We are going to go to around about 35% opacity, size 30 as always. And then just on the edge of the tree and only to around about sort of this point here, just draw in a line down here. It's super, super faint. If I zoom in for you, you can see this line here. We do not want to be accenting this tree very much at all. That was very cockney of me almost there for a second. I'm just adding in another slight line just beside it and then a dash or two either side. I might add another coat of brown just on the edge. Now, we only want to do that because the lighting is so behind this tree that it's just going to make this a silhouette. However, we can go ahead and create a new layer. Tap on it, clipping mask it, go to your blend mode and change it to color dodge. We can go to our colors, grab the bottom of the second column from the right again. Brush can be set to airbrushing and the soft brush. And then set your size really, really small. We're going to zoom in and where you've got your beams coming across, this is quite important really. If you set your brush size to say 2%, where you've got your beams, you kind of want to come down the edge and then where you've got a beam, just come into the body of the tree, just a tiny bit. So you create this kind of orangey tone there. Then come down again, another little bit of orange here where the beams are, but just a very slight outline. And then maybe just a little extra one down here just for a little bit of extra something. Lovely. So that just kind of emphasizes where those beams are crashing into our scene. Then we'll go to our layers and we'll pinch all three of them together. We'll go ahead and go to our adjustments, Gaussian blur, and swipe from left to right and just blur that out to around about 4 to 5%. Tap on your adjustments when you're done. So you've now got this lovely little hazy kind of look to it. And then go to your layer. You can swipe it to the left and duplicate it. I'll move it across so you can see. And if I change the blend mode to color dodge, it may just emphasize those colors. See how it just, if I turn it on and off, it just makes it punch out a bit more. And you can do that one more time if you really want to, just to see how it looks. But I'm going to go ahead and just do it the one time. That looks okay as it is. Now let's go ahead and add in some, I would refer to it as magic. I always love referring to it as magic. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer at the top of our layers. I'm going to go to my colors and grab this tone here, bottom of the 6th column. My brush is going to be the option of luminance. It will say luminance for you. And we've got the light pen. I've got maximum opacity and size is maxed out because this is a pressure sensitive brush. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in a few different layers of sort of magic, as I would refer to it. So we're going to tap away, adding in a lot of tiny little specks, a couple of large ones, really sort of lay them out all over the place, but through the beams primarily if you can, and then around your subject too. So don't go too mad with the first layer, just adding in a little bit of something that we can blur out in just a second. And I think if I get rid of that one and put one, say there, I'm good to go straight away. So once you've put a little bit of content like this, go to your adjustments, Gaussian blur, swipe from left to right, and you can blur them out up to around about 4%. We're going to go to the layer and change it from normal to the option of color dodge. We're then going to create another new layer. we're going to go to our pen again and just start drawing in yet again. So you've got all these little fine dots in here as well. Just a little bit now of a couple of sharper ones that we're adding in. This layer is in a moment going to get changed to the add blend mode. So we're going to try and layer in quite a few of these little lovely sparkles in here. You can have the rogue one go a little bit higher and out of position if you like. A little bit up here, for example. Then go to the layer, change it from normal to the option of add. We'll go to our adjustments. We'll go to Gaussian blur and we'll swipe from left to right until we get 7% or 6 or 7, either one. You're going to end up with some extra little further distant blurred out ones. And then we'll create one more new layer here for the magic. And this one is just going to be what you draw in. You're not going to add any extra effects to this one. So these are going to be a really sharp ones, so you can go over them. You can tap on a little sparkle once or twice as well, and then that just really emphasizes the color. Sometimes a singular tap, you end up with quite a faint little dot, but you can tap in there a few times to add in a little rays of magic. Up here at the top, feel free to add in a few more. And by all means, if you feel like maybe you went a bit too crazy with the other layers, you can go back to, say, for instance, the first layer, grab your eraser, set your eraser to airbrushing and the soft brush as an example. And if you set that to about 2%, you could probably get in there then and just see, well, if I could get rid of one there, that would look nice. And if I can get rid of one there, and then maybe if I take away a little bit in there too, and a little bit there, and then go to the add layer and just start taking away a few of them. Sometimes it's really easy early on to go a bit too crazy, but go back to the top layer that's set to normal and then just draw back in again. So you can make space basically if you need to. Add in a few, and I want to add in like one or two that's just a little bit bigger. Got a little bit more to it. And then maybe like a stray one all the way back there, and then one just there too. Lovely. That should just break up that kind of cone almost shape of all of the little bits coming through. Now, before we get into the bloom effect that we're going to add right at the end here, I just want to make one adjustment, and that's to my bridge. And where I've got the content here at the underside of the bridge, the green, I want to tap on that and bring the opacity down of that a little bit further, down to around about 40%. I also want to find the highlight lines there that we added to the tree, and that will be this color dodge layer. I'm going to tap on it. I'm going to go ahead and grab my eraser and set my eraser to soft airbrush under airbrushing, because now we've got everything in play. I can see that I don't really like some of these highlights. They're a bit too prominent. They're also a little bit too uniformed as well. They're all the same kind of tone. So I'm just going to randomly patch in the soft airbrush eraser there just to try and get rid of some of it. If anything, I ended up creating a bit of a line that runs through. So I'm just going to tone some of these down. In fact, get rid of quite a few of them. I want to tone them down in certain areas. I don't see them sort of highlighting too much, whereas that looks really nice. So I'm going to just tone that down a tiny bit as well, and we're good to go. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to add a bloom effect. We're going to go right to the top of our layers right up here and create a new layer. Make sure your guide is turned off with this tick. You want to tap away, swipe down with 3 fingers and go to copy all, and swipe down with 3 fingers and go to paste. That will have pasted your entire design onto one new layer, and now we can apply some effects. So we're going to go to our adjustments. We're going to go to the option of bloom, and I've got transition set to max, size 30, burn 35% for a minute. And then I'm going to swipe from left to right. At the top, you'll see the bloom effect. Just keep dragging that up from left to right until you start to see everything now look, get a little bit glowy. Now you can go up to say something around about, say, 80% potentially. Everybody's design is going to be very different depending on a few factors. The amount of color that you've added here on the tree and your beams. What I urge you to do is, if it's starting to look too bright, but you do want to add the bloom, undo these steps. So undo this layer, delete it, for example, and then go back to your beams, which is this add layer here, which we added earlier on, and maybe tap on it and bring the opacity down of them. You could bring it down just something simple like 85%, repeat the steps, 3 fingers, copy all, 3 fingers, paste. Then go to your adjustments, go to bloom again, and then repeat. So that's just me showing you something that you can do. Now, if I go up to 80%, again, where I was just a second ago, I can see that brightness. Now, if I tap here with a finger and go to preview and hold down on preview, I can see the difference between them. You do end up with this really magical kind of glow to this area of our design. but you don't want to overdo it. Burn will make a huge difference. It really overexposes things. So just take your time to sort of just mess around slightly with the settings. Again, always use the preview on and off just to see the difference. You can drag it all the way up to 100% just to at least see what that looks like. But bring it down and try to do less, to be honest. Don't go too mad. It can always look, overdone potentially. So for me, actually, I can go up to something fairly large as long as I keep the burn down here a little bit lower. So if I tap on preview, I can see the difference in that lovely bright area of our tree. I'm going to leave it exactly like that. So you can see my settings, max 30 and 35, 84% bloom, and then tap on my adjustments when I'm done. I can pinch with 2 fingers, go full screen with 4, and we end up with today's finished design. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. As always, make sure to tag me in your finished creations wherever you decide to share them. Facebook and Instagram are great places for me to see your work, as well as my Discord, all of which will be linked in the description down below of this video. As always, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more Procreate tutorials. I release tutorials here every single week on my YouTube channel. I also provide 3 more additional tutorials every single month, but they are exclusive to my Patreon supporters. I've got a catalogue now of well over 120, nearly 130 at the time of recording, exclusive Patreon tutorials where I will go into slightly more depth in some slightly larger projects, and you can see all of the project designs over on my website before you join. That way you know that the content is fit for you. So make sure to check that out using the link in the description down below. And if you like this video here on YouTube, you'll love this one on the screen now. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.